So now the Greek army, instead of advancing, is retreating. And if you look at your map there, you'll see that you see this little town called Konya. There's a little town kind of in the middle. And suddenly this is where the Turks started to defeat the Greeks and started to push them toward Smyrna. And by now we're reading that the Turkish that the harbor, it said the harbor of Smyrna, the perfect crescent as emblazoned on the Turkish flag, held an imposing display of Allied might at daybreak. This was on the 9th of September of 1922. There were warships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers. They were French, they were Italian, they were British, and there were 3 American destroyers that came in. One of the destroyers, the Litchfield, and the interviews with the American sailors for this book, that were still alive when this book was written, they said, we didn't really know why we were there because the Americans had no interest in Smyrna. But they did have some property there. And those properties were, let me see if I can find the reference to that. What those properties were there were 2 schools. One of the schools was the College Institute for Girls, and that was your great-grandmother's school that she went to. And that was located in the heart of the Armenian quarter in Smyrna. And then there was an international college for boys. There was no co-ed education in those days. There's also 2 other facilities. There was a YWCA and a YMCA. And the reason that the American ships came down was to protect these properties. They weren't to take refugees off or give any help to anybody. And the result of this was that eventually, because of the concerns that the Turkish army was moving into Smyrna, they sent the sailors out, and eventually three destroyers came in, and the sailors came off of these ships, and the sailors were positioned around these various properties of the Americans. The 4 properties, plus we had a consulate there in Smyrna. And that's why basically they were there. And one of the things that they were told by our State Department was, don't be taking sides in this fight. This is not our fight. We're only here to protect our properties. So keep that in mind, because it starts to explain how your great-grandmother was able to escape. We go on, and on the 26th of August, we read, the Greek front collapsed 200 miles to the east. Scarcely a soul in Smyrna was aware of the imminent catastrophe, despite the city's 23 newspapers representing every conceivable attitude toward the Greco-Turkish war. And then the Greeks thought, and the Armenians and the Greeks in the city thought, this was only going to be a temporary setback. But on 1st of September came word that the Greeks had abandoned Uşak, which was 140 miles east of Smyrna. And now people are getting nervous. And then suddenly, on the first day of September, the city started to see Greek wounded began arriving. They came in interminable train loads, the carriages and freight cars so tightly packed that men were sitting and lying on the roofs of the cabs. And then fleeing soldiers arrived next. on every possible mode of conveyance, ox carts, huge wheeled chariots, trucks, camels, horses. But as soon as it became clear, and this happens with armies, when they suddenly realize that there's no, that everything is falling apart, what happens is you don't get orderly retreats from armies, you get absolute chaos. Everybody starts running. And they said there were thousands, many thousands on foot, dragging one after the other if they had two to drag. And it became clear that the flight was massive, disorganized, as thousands more who had lost their way to embarkation points poured directly into Smyrna. And now you can imagine what's going on with the civilians when they see the Greek army suddenly racing back, disorganized, many wounded, everything in chaos. Civilian refugees now, as the Greek army was retreating, civilians in the interior were now also flooding into Smyrna. So it wasn't just the people of Smyrna, but now it was refugees besides that. Within days, the panic spread to the local Greeks and Armenians and touched the foreign colony as well. Consular officials cabled their governments for more ships to take away the nationals if such a move became necessary. And at the same time, the British, the French, and Italian consuls gave formal assurances to the Armenians and Greeks that their lives were in no danger. So, now we go on to so it was at this time now that all this chaos was taking place, that the American Navy and the commanders of these ships, with the consulate from their State Department, sent the sailors out now to position themselves around these various American properties. Another chapter, another passage. The panic grew. The railways ceased to operate as the Armenians and Greek employees hurried home to their families. The Turkish army now is starting to slowly infiltrate into the city. Native Smyrnians, as well as refugees, rushed to foreign buildings to ask for protection. Possessing the most institutions and the reputation for the most benevolence, the Americans were the most harassed. Turkish patrols distributing leaflets, and this is the first arrival of the Turks. Turkish patrols distributing leaflets printed in Turkish and Greek handed one to the Reverend Abraham Hartunian, an Armenian evangelical pastor, as he was returning to the American Collegiate Institute. And the leaflet said, Mustafa Kemal has given strict orders to soldiers to harm no one. Those who disobey these orders will be punished by death. And so this led people to kind of a false sense of maybe things would not be as bad. But then we start seeing things are starting to change. On Saturday afternoon and in the evening, the Turkish infantry, following the cavalry into Smyrna in perfect order and discipline, and in a bewildering assortment of uniforms, uniforms. Then it starts. Armenian and Greek shops were the first to be looted. Small bands of civilians. Now, first of all, the Turkish civilians in town, seeing what was happening, they started to go into the Greek and the Armenian quarters, and they started to loot the shops. And then small bands of civilians initiated the action, keeping discreetly to side streets, discovering that Italian and Turkish patrols were standing. By offering no interference, soldiers too now became emboldened and they were soon joined by their officers. Looting soon turned to armed robbery. Lieutenant Merrill, one of the American officers off the destroyer, watched a band of soldiers hold up a civilian in the Armenian district and go through his pockets. They paid no attention to us. Inside, and Lieutenant Merrill then noticed, he said, now that the shutters of these homes that we were talking about had been closed tight. Inside, families huddled together in darkened rooms trying to convince one another that they were being unreasonably fearful. On a Sunday, Mustafa Kemal finally arrived in the city. Entrance to two long lines of cavalrymen drew up their swords, sun flashing on steel. They galloped alongside his open touring car as it made its way through cheering throngs, obviously of Turkish throngs, to the government house abandoned by the Greeks the days before. I mentioned that Mustafa Kemal became Ataturk, who became the founder of modern Turkey. He had decided he would confine his nation's boundaries to an area acceptable to the West. The motto, Turkey for the Turks, had already been determined. Kemal would mount a campaign to purify the very language of every strain not essentially Turkish. The bulk of the Jewish population would eventually be driven out through discriminatory taxation and cultural pressures. In joining his nation to the 20th century, Kemal was to complete the task begun by his predecessors, the final effacing of its unassimilable elements from the land. By now, the conqueror's task was considerably lightened. The northeast provinces, these areas up in the north we were talking about, the northeastern provinces were wiped clean of Armenians. So, in fact, was virtually every hamlet, village, and town throughout Anatolia. And what was left was less than 200,000 remained in Constantinople and Smyrna. So, news started to spread that the Turks were killing Armenians in the back street. And all this information started to be fed into the consulates. Bombs were meanwhile raining in on the walled courtyard of the Armenian cathedral, where over 1,000 local inhabitants barricaded themselves for precautions. So people now are trying to take shelter in cathedral. Those that staying in their homes and their quarters, some very, very horrible things were going on. People were being murdered. Women were being carried away. I mean, the thing was just an absolute nightmare. So now let's. 1922. This is all happening in really a very, very brief period of time. So now we come to the school where the College Institute, where your great-grandmother was a student at one time, and then she became part of the teaching staff. And she had gone to the school. We don't know where the rest of her family was. I never did figure that out, where Aunt Rose and Uncle John were. Huh?
She get to Greece.
Yes, but I'm talking about now while they're still there. So I'm going to read this part to you here. The first mention of your great-grandmother came in, let's see. For several days there had been signs in the Armenian quarter that the Turks were preparing a conflagration. And this one witness says, I saw with my own eyes, and by the way, I had no idea about your great-grandmother being in this book. I'm reading this chapter. And I'm starting to read this chapter. It says, for several days there had been signs in the Armenian quarter the Turks were preparing a conflagration. I saw with my own eyes the Turks taking bombs, gunpowder, kerosene, and everything necessary to start fires, said the Reverend Abraham Hartunian. Well, that same day, Anita Chakarian, a young teacher at the Institute, saw the Turks guards dragging into building large sacks which they deposited in various quarters. And when they were questioned, so this is the first reference we have to our mother, that she was at the school. And the Turks said they were bringing in rice and potatoes to feed the people, but then eventually the sacks were open, and what they found in it was gunpowder and dynamite. At 1 a.m., another one of the ladies at the Greek Institute saw 3 fires in the neighborhood. And at 4 a.m., fires in a small wooden hut adjoining the college wall were put out in the afternoon. The fire in Smyrna has always been there's always been a big argument about the fire. The Turks said that, well, the fire just happened because there was shooting and bombing and fire started, and the Armenians, the Americans, the Greeks, they said the Turks set the fire. The Turks set the fire. And when you hear about Ataturk trying to cleanse the city, it's pretty obvious what happened. Fires were springing up all over the place. And of course, these fires meant that there was only one thing that could happen. People had to get out. They couldn't stay. Across the street from the school, women could see 3 Turkish officers silhouetted in the window of a photographer's shop opposite. Moments after the men emerged, flames poured from the roof and the windows, and like all other buildings, this was burning from the inside. And then Miss Mills, remember Miss Mills? She was the head of the school. She said, I could plainly see the Turks carrying tins of petroleum into the houses from which, in each instant, fire burst forth immediately. There was a fire brigade. They kept trying to put out fires, but eventually there were too many of them, like the San Francisco earthquake, and they just gave up. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, fires were closing in on 3 sides of the school, and there was still no word from naval headquarters as to what to do with the people, with the Americans in the school. Refugees who had been sheltered in the laundry rooms at the most vulnerable point in the compound were added to the crush in the main building and told to wait for the signal to leave. They could smell the smoke and hear the explosion just beyond. And by this time, there were 2,000 refugees in the grounds of the school. Realizing that evacuation was inevitable, but with only 12 sailors on hand, a mass exodus of all the inmates would spell disaster. Miss Mills, after a conference with the naval chief, the Navy man, instructed her staff to weed out the school family from the bulk of the refugees, meaning the Americans and the Greek and the Armenian teachers, the faculty, the staff, so that sailors might escort the smaller group to the waterfront ahead of the mob. But the sorting out, which had to be done discreetly to avoid a stampede, was complicated by the fact that the vast majority of teachers, servants, and students refused to be separated from their families. Instructed to gather at the rear gate, they brought their relatives with them and crowded behind Miss Mills and the sailors, accompanied by several hundred alert refugees who were keeping a close watch on the movements of the Americans and taking no chances of left behind. The shutters at one end had caught fire, just as Ensign Gaylord, and he was the he was the top officer there at the school. He drove up to the rear gate in a truck with orders from Captain Hepburn. And Captain Hepburn was the main Foreign Service officer there in the harbor, that the sailors were to abandon the building and escort bona fide Americans only to the docks. But Miss Mills refused to budge without her students and staff. Gaylord barked an order. Three of the men, Miss Mills refused to budge without her students. Gaylord barked an order. Can you imagine this, Gracie? That's it. Three of the men lifted Miss Mills on their shoulders and carried her through the back door. And Miss Mills, as she was being carried out, she's saying to her staff, "Girls, girls, follow me, follow me." She shouted. She was still struggling when they put her, along with several dozen students and employees, into the truck and drove away. But Mom was not on the truck. She didn't make it. She didn't make it. There was too much chaos, and as they were trying to get on it, she was one of the ones that didn't make it. So now all that was left with Miss Mills, the staff, and heading down toward the waterfront. Petty Officer James Webster and 6 sailors remained. He said to the rest of them, "We cannot be responsible for you once we open the doors." One of them announced, "We advise you all to leave together. Stay close together, as close as you can." And then he opened the gates to lead the way. Webster had to push his way through the gate. They were miles from the waterfront, and none of the sailors knew which way to turn. Some of the streets were on fire. Burning rubble was blocking others. Turks were shooting into the crowd behind him. To keep from being stampeded, he had to stop every few minutes and fire over the heads of his followers. Now we get to your great-grandmother. Anita Khachadourian tried to follow, but the door was narrow, and the crush at the exit overwhelmed her. She found herself being pushed and pulled in circles. She stumbled, lost a shoe, and would have been trampled but for 2 strong arms lifting her and carrying her out the door. It was one of the sailors. She said, "To this day, I still wonder who he was." She says, "God bless him for saving my life." Pretty lucky for that sailor that he picked our mom up. Now, how these people, they were still quite a ways from the harbor, but they followed the sailors down as a group. Remember now, it's not the whole 2,000. These people are scattered all over. But still, what's left of the staff, they stay together, and they eventually make it down to the harbor. The harbor now has thousands and thousands and thousands of people. Now, your dad, your Grammy, and I, we walked down, and Izmir, there's a huge bay around Izmir, but when we walked out to the water, remember we walked a ways, and then we saw a stone jetty. Remember the stone jetty that was there? And, you know, it was really funny, the feeling that came over us, and I just stopped and I said, and we looked up and down, and the waterfront ran a long ways. And we stopped there and realized that this is where these thousands and thousands of people were trying to escape the Turks who were looting, killing, all kinds of atrocities going on behind them, and the fire at their backs. And the only place they could go was the waterfront, hoping that one of these foreign ships, all the battleships, somebody was going to take them off.